has fallen to us to defend Jerusalem, and we have made our preparations as well as they can be made. None of us took this city from Muslims. No Muslim of the great army now coming against us was born when this city was lost. We fight over an offense we did not give, against those who were not alive to be offended. What is Jerusalem? Your holy places lie over the Jewish temple that the Romans pulled down. The Muslim places of worship lie over yours. Which is more holy? The wall? The mosque? The sepulchre? Who has claim? No one has claim. All have claim!
That is blasphemy!
Be quiet.
We defend this city, not to protect these stones, but the people living within these walls.
My lord! My lord! My lord! How are we to defend Jerusalem without knights? We have no knights!
Truly. What is your condition?
I'm servant to the Patriarch.
He's one of my servants.
Is he? You were born a servant. Kneel. Every man at arms, or capable of bearing them, kneel! On your knees! Be without fear in the face of your enemies. Be brave and upright that God may love thee. Speak the truth, even if it leads to your death. Safeguard the helpless. That is your oath. And that is so you remember it. Rise a knight! Rise a knight! Master Gravedigger.
It is you.
Not what I was, nor are you. Rise a knight.
Who do you think you are? Will you alter the world? Doesn't making a man a knight make him a better fighter?
Yes.
Hello and welcome to A Spirited Debate. I'm Lauren Green. There is growing outrage over a video purportedly showing a mass execution of Ethiopian Christians in Libya by terrorists affiliated with ISIS. In the video released Sunday, Islamic State militants in Libya shot and beheaded groups of captive Ethiopian Christians. It is a repeat of what occurred to 21 Egyptian Coptic Christians a few weeks ago in Libya. The Coptic community is condemning the attacks on the Ethiopians. Here with their reactions is Lindsay Vesey, Director of Development and Advocacy for Coptic Solidarity. Welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you for having me.
So first of all, what is your reaction to seeing these ISIS killings of the Ethiopian Christians?
Well, of course, it's horrific, and our thoughts and prayers are with the families of these victims. But I have to say, we really aren't that surprised because policy towards ISIS hasn't really changed since the 21 Coptic Christians were killed 2 months ago. And so honestly, I think that this is just something that's going to continue to happen until the international community decides that they're going to take concerted action, not only to protect the religious minorities, such as Copts, Yazidis, Baha'i, other faith groups in the Middle East and North Africa, and also they're going to have to make a decision about defeating ISIS militarily.
You know, they were reportedly killed for not paying what's called a jizya tax or something. What is that?
Right. The jizya tax actually dates back to the times of Muhammad. And at that time, if you did not convert to Islam, you had to pay this tax as protection money, and that would allow you to stay whatever faith you were, but to live as a second-class citizen. And so what's interesting is that was codified in the Codes of Omar, and this has been the way that Christians and other minorities have been treated all through the centuries under Muslim rule. And so the Islamic State is trying to go back to that early type of Sharia law, basically. And so they're saying, if you do not convert to Islam, then you must pay this tax, and it's like a protection money. And so these Ethiopians who were killed, from the best reports that we have gotten, we've been told that they essentially didn't have the money to pay, and so they had to choose convert to Islam or die, and they actually chose death over converting to Islam.
You know, would you classify this fight against ISIS as a holy war?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think it depends on who you ask. Coptic Solidarity is a human rights organization. You know, we're not really involved in defining Islam or, in talking about that aspect of it. But I think something that's interesting with the White House statement, we talked, when the 21 Copts were murdered, and the White House refused to acknowledge that they were killed for their faith. This time around, they acknowledged that they were killed for their faith, solely for their faith, it actually said. But in their next statement, in the next paragraph, what's interesting is they try to kind of gloss over history as if people have always gotten along in this region. And that's just simply not the case. Most of the Jews have been driven out in that region, or they've been killed. The Armenian genocide, we're celebrating or commemorating, I guess you could say, the 100-year anniversary this year of the Armenian genocide. And so I think the point that we would like to make is that this has been an ongoing problem. That's why Coptic Solidarity exists, because there is not equality for Copts or any other religious minorities in the region. So, when the White House says that people have always gotten along, they've lived side by side as neighbors, well, they've lived side by side, but they've lived as second-class citizens. Mm-hmm. So whether or not they had to pay the jizya tax, they've had to live in subjugation, basically, without the equal opportunities in education and everything else, basically.
How should the U.S. respond? I mean, after the 21 Copts were beheaded, Egypt responded with airstrikes. I mean, is that something that you would want the U.S. to do on behalf of Ethiopia?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question. First, they need to call it what it is, and they did this time, sort of. But secondly, I think we need to work with the international community. This can't be seen as just something the United States is doing. We all need to work together, but we do need to take military action because ISIS is not going away. The UN actually recently put out a statement regarding what's happening in Libya, and it says that military defeat is not an option. It needs to be a political solution with all the parties. How is that ever going to happen when you have all of these jihadists in Libya? I mean, it just doesn't even make sense. So I think what we're calling for is we want to see those countries in the region and interested international partners, led by the UN Security Council, come together and actually deal with this in a military fashion and not just seek for diplomatic solutions, because ISIS, they're not going to respond to diplomatic solutions.
Yeah. All right. I want to thank you so much, Lindsay Vesey from Coptic Solidarity. Thank you very much for being on A Spirited Debate.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
We're sitting down with Michael Scheuer, the man who had served in the CIA for more than 20 years, up until 2004. At one time, he was the chief of the CIA Bin Laden unit. Then he went and exposed how counter-effective Washington's methods were in the fight against terror. He looked at the U.S. through its enemy's eyes. In fact, it's the title of one of his books called Through Our Enemy's Eyes. I'm very pleased to have the chance to interview you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Scheuer.
I'm glad to be here.
Bin Laden is gone. Who is Washington's number one enemy now?
Washington's enemy is an enemy that doesn't exist. We're fighting an Islamic enemy that Washington believes is out to kill us because we have elections, because we're free, because we have women in the workplace. It's an enemy that doesn't exist. It didn't exist when bin Laden was alive. It doesn't exist now. America is being attacked because of its foreign policy in the Muslim world, because of its support for Israel, because of its support for the Saudi police state, because of its presence on the Arab Peninsula. And until we accept that, until Americans can say to each other, whether you support aid to Israel or not, our relationship with Israel is causing this war, we are not going to be able to defeat this enemy. And Israel itself as a country is not the problem. The real problem is the leaders of the Jewish American community in the United States who influence and corrupt our Congress to support Israel when we have no interest there.
You imply that the Israeli lobby is dragging the United States into the wars, into
Absolutely.
the conflicts?
They're absolutely dragging us in. Iraq was a war that was proffered or was called for mainly.
Then let me ask you this.
Yeah.
The situation in the region, in the wake of all these revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa,
Yes.
you can pretty much describe it as turmoil. Turmoil is no good for Israel. Isn't there a contradiction to what you're saying?
Well, the American political establishment is caught between two things. They're extremely pro-Israel, and they're almost Marxist in their belief that democracy and the spread of democracy is inevitable in all places, in all peoples, at all times. And so they need to protect the Israelis, but they can't say what is a reality. For example, there is not going to be a democracy in Tunisia or Libya or Egypt that in any way resembles democracy in the West. And yet what they've done is create anarchy. They've created a situation where the only beneficiaries are the Islamists. The guns that have flown out of Egypt, out of Tunisia, out of Libya to the Islamists have been enormous in their volume. And the prisons that were opened in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya have reinforced the Islamist groups across the world. So their mindless pursuit of secular democracy, at the end of the day, endangers the stability of the region and probably the whole world.
Are you saying we're going to see further radicalization of the region?
Oh, especially in Africa. Yes, ma'am. The guns that are flowing out of the three places where there were Arab Spring revolts are going to cause problems in Somalia, across North Africa, and in Nigeria.
Let's talk about Syria.
Yes.
Syria says the earth will start shaking if anyone intervenes in their internal affairs. How badly does the U.S. Is the U.S. trying to interfere?
Oh, I think we're interfering unconscionably. Until they removed the U.S. ambassador, he was running around the country trying to encourage groups to overthrow the Syrian government. That is not the role of any diplomat, United States or Russian or Chinese or British. We have really very cold-bloodedly urged Syrians to get out on the street knowing that they're going to get shot down by their government. Again, Syria is a country where there is no U.S. interest. Since I was a little boy, we've been afraid of the Syrians, and if you look at the map, it's hard to imagine that little blot of country called Syria could be a threat to the United States.
The CIA has reportedly worked with the Syrian opposition for years.
Well, I'm not sure we worked with the Syrian opposition. We've certainly worked with the Syrian
WikiLeaks
government.
cables.
Well, I haven't. Yeah. Well, then, if it's there, it's there. But our relationship with the Syrians is really a relatively unimportant one. But again, it's another very good example of the dichotomy in the thinking of American leaders. Because as we call for democracy in Syria, if Assad goes, Israel's security goes straight down.
If the region becomes a complete mess, doesn't Washington see any dangers to Israel? I mean, with Iran involved, it won't be pretty.
I think that's exactly right, ma'am. I don't know what the thinking is, except that they have come down on the belief that democracy is better for everybody. And the truth is, American and Western foreign policy interests in the Middle East have depended for 50 years on the maintenance of tyranny. Tyranny that gave us access to oil, tyranny that protected Israel, and in the last 20 years, tyrannies that persecuted Islamists to protect us. All of that is going by the wayside. And to the Israelis' credit, the Israelis are the only ones who have stood up and said, democracy may not be very good for our security, and they couldn't be more correct.
About Iran, what's Washington's plan for Iran?
Whatever Israel's plan is for Iran, both parties, Republicans and Democrats, are deathly afraid that the Israelis will attack them off their own hook. And if Israel attacks Iran, the Americans will get blamed for condoning it, whether we did or not. So I think what we're seeing is a slow, almost inexorable advance toward some kind of a conflict with Iran. What
do you make of these recent accusations that the Iranian government was trying to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington?
I'm not in a position to know whether or not the information was accurate. But when I was a young intelligence officer, I worked against Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah. And I can tell you, in the 90s, they were meticulous in covering their tracks and only using as agents of terrorism their own people. The plot that was described by the Attorney General of the United States is a comic opera.
Through a Mexican drug cartel.
Yeah, and to believe that the Iranians would risk war with the United States, Israel, and much of NATO to kill a Saudi ambassador who was not even part of the royal family, that's hard for me to believe.
Let's talk about Libya. Libya is in ruins in the wake of NATO bombings. Yes. It's brimming with weapons.
Yes.
An al-Qaeda flag was planted over a courthouse in Benghazi.
Yes.
How good of a playground is Libya for people with radical agendas?
Very strong Islamist presence in Libya. Since the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan, Libya has sent as many of its people to fight in those insurgencies, the Islamist insurgencies, as any other country in North Africa, maybe outside of Saudi Arabia. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group fought a long time against the Soviets. They fought against Gaddafi. A great number of Libyans went to Iraq and to Afghanistan to fight us. And whatever strength the Libyan resistance had in terms of military capability, that came from experienced Islamist fighters. So the idea that somehow there's democracy afoot in Libya is just simply wrong.
Could it become a hotbed of terror?
I don't know if it could become a hotbed of terror, but it can become a country that's decidedly anti-American, anti-NATO. It can be probably less a hotbed of terror than a country that is vastly unstable.
It seems the U.S. is almost creating grounds for terrorists to surge and then goes out fighting them. We see it in Pakistan. They got the whole nation alienated because of the strikes. A lot of people want revenge. How efficient is that?
We are very efficient in this day and age, in the last 20 years, in creating enemies. We're not very efficient in creating security for the United States. We have the best educated population in the world, and we have the people with the littlest amount of common sense. How many times have we heard Mr. Clinton, Mr. Bush, Mr. Obama say, this has nothing to do with religion, this is not a religious war, this is a bunch of people who are just madmen. We are definitely fighting a religious war. And until we come to realize that, we are never going to be able to defeat it. In fact, we're encouraging the growth of a new generation of people who are going to fight us.
The U.S. is pulling its troops out of Iraq, but at the same time, it's boosting its military presence in the Persian Gulf. More ground troops are planned to be deployed. New drone bases are being built. What do you make of such expansion?
It just demonstrates again the ignorance of the United States government in terms of its political leadership about what our problem is in the Muslim world. The key point of formation for al-Qaeda was the presence of U.S. military forces on the Arabian Peninsula. 15 years after they declared war on us, we're now going to take people out of Iraq and put them in Kuwait and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, reinforcing our presence on the Arab Peninsula. Only going to cause us more foes and more enemies in the Islamic world. It's a contradiction. It's a lack of common sense.
Let me ask you this: if the U.S. pulls out of everywhere,
yes,
is it going to be the end of terrorism?
It certainly would deny the terrorists the glue of unity that keeps them focused on the United States. If we weren't the main enemy, they would be attacking Israel, they would be attacking the Saudis, they would be attacking the Moroccans. The war would be
And would you say let them attack
go.
The Israelis and the Saudis?
Let them go. Sometimes they say the Chinese will come in. I said, let the Chinese deal with these people for the next 50 years. We've had enough of it. But I think the point is the Americans can't get out. We're dependent on the Saudis to maintain our interests in the world oil market, and the Saudis buy, next to the Chinese, more of our debt than anyone else. So as long as we're side by side with the Saudis and with the Israelis, we're stuck in the Middle East, and America will continue to bleed.
Dr. Schroyer, thanks for the interview.
Yes, ma'am.
In effect, the United States created ISIS. Nothing like it existed before the American occupation. We created it. It's ours. And now we're trying to deal with the consequences. Okay, you ready? The war in Iraq, in the streets of Baghdad, no less than in the halls of Congress or in the stump speeches of the campaign trail, is in its essence political, not military. Like the terrorists who hijacked American airliners and flew them into American buildings, the fighters daily ambushing American troops are attacking not American military power, but American will. And thanks to the way President Bush and his colleagues chose to build the case for war, and the errors they've made in prosecuting it, American will is an increasingly vulnerable target. In the end, defeat or victory in Iraq will be judged not by who controls Baghdad, but by whether the war has left Americans more secure than they were before it was undertaken. I wrote this piece in July 2003. The insurgency very slowly, very particularly, very specifically, looking at the various slender lines that supported the occupation and cutting precisely each line. The UN, snip. The UN fled the country. The Jordanians who might lend troops to the effort, snip. The Jordanian embassy is attacked. And even as the American leaders in the United States are telling the American people that there's no insurgency at all, by the late summer, it's absolutely clear that not only is there an insurgency, but it is well-led, well-planned, and absolutely ruthless. The point of this piece was to try to identify this insurgency as the root enemy in the new war. The first weeks of the occupation, in which security in Baghdad collapsed, chaos ruled the streets, and the fledgling occupation authority daily issued conflicting statements and made promises it did not keep, were a fiasco. They proved an enormous boon to violent opponents, providing them in the lawless streets of post-war Iraq the political equivalent of a warm petri dish in which to grow. It had been based on the threat of weapons of mass destruction, which turned out not to have existed. It was based also on a promise given by the political leadership of the Bush administration to the American people that the war would be, as one Bush ally put it, a cakewalk. Both of those promises were proved in the first months of the war to be egregiously, tragically, terribly wrong. Suddenly, the Americans were caught in a kind of existential, lonely world of the present. Where are we? Why are we fighting? Why did we come here? When will we leave? The enemy in Iraq, in other words, is dynamic and changeable. A shadowy and loose group of forces made up of former officers and soldiers of the vast security and intelligence organs of the Ancien regime. Foreign-born jihadis, or ideological commandos, who have slipped into Iraq from Saudi Arabia, Syria, and other Islamic countries, determined to confront and defeat the United States. And perhaps increasingly, young unemployed Iraqis, angry at the American occupation and the difficulties it has brought, eager to avenge a relative's death or a personal affront, or simply desperate to earn some easy money by hiring themselves out to attack Americans. When you look at the goals of al-Qaeda when they attacked the United States on 9/11, what was the goal exactly? First of all, to create this enormous image or kind of recruiting poster for jihadism, the image of the towers falling, the image of the towers attack. But secondly, it was to draw the United States out of its hole, as one of the al-Qaeda theorists put it. It was to, in their ambition, to drag the United States into a quagmire in Afghanistan. And like the Soviets before them, we are going to defeat the United States on the battlefield in Afghanistan. That was their thought. Well, of course, the U.S. did not occupy Afghanistan right away in the way they expected. They did something much more beneficial to the jihadist cause. They occupied Iraq and they provided day after day, month after month, telegenic images of American troops abusing Muslims. This was exactly what al-Qaeda wanted to create. I mean, if you look at the images from Abu Ghraib, they might as well be recruitment posters made on Madison Avenue for the jihadi cause. The first result of that was the insurgency itself. The second result of it is ISIS. Because ISIS, of course, is the child, the descendant of al-Qaeda in Iraq, or al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, or al-Qaeda of the Two Rivers, whatever name you'd like to use. It is a result of Sunni hatred, dissatisfaction, and vulnerability at the new order in Iraq. That Iraqis loyal to a security-obsessed totalitarian regime of 3 decades would seek to fight the Americans who have overthrown it is not surprising. Nor should it be surprising that jihadis from outside and inside Iraq should seize the opportunity to attack infidels occupying an Islamic country. What is surprising is the degree to which the Americans, through their own lack of attention to the critical political tasks of the war's aftermath, have in effect assisted their efforts. What was the basic political task of the occupation of Iraq? It was to somehow switch power from the Sunni minority to the Shia majority, and to do it in a way that the Sunnis would accept it non-violently. In fact, if you look at the early days of the occupation, everything the Americans did seems to have been pointed toward the opposite goal. The Americans acted again and again by dissolving the army, by de-Ba'athifying the country, by doing a number of very stupid policies. They acted again and again to enrage the Sunnis, to make them more vulnerable, to make them think they had to fight. Because a key part of the insurgency, even though we think now of ISIL as the Islamic State, that is, as mainly jihadist, in fact, it has a key cadre, a key level of functioning that comes from the Iraqi army, all of whom came from this relatively successful, very large army that we dissolved with very little thought beforehand and sent 400,000 young men onto the streets without any salaries and with simply their guns. So we humiliated these people. We laid the seeds down for the insurgency, without a doubt. In effect, the United States created ISIS. Nothing like it existed before the American occupation. It was an insurgency that battened on the hatred of the Americans and the vulnerability and hatred of the Sunnis for the Shia. There's no way to understand it happening without the Americans there, because it built itself like a kind of bacterial host on the American occupation. We created it, it's ours, and now we're trying to deal with the consequences. Not for the first time, the United States has shown itself to be a strange hybrid creature, military giant and political dwarf. But Iraq is not Lebanon, from which the U.S. could sail away and invade Grenada. The stakes are much higher. In the words of Hassan Salameh, the former Lebanese government minister and scholar, who was working for the UN headquarters in Baghdad when it was bombed, you can't just get up and walk away from Iraq like you did Lebanon. No matter how bad it gets, if Iraq turns into anarchy, it's likely to spill into the rest of the Gulf. It would be a catastrophe. I think it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Watch out what you wish for, you will create it. And that is exactly what the United States ended up doing. Once the U.S. began striking ISIS from the air in August 2014, there was an enormous surge in Islamic State recruitment. Haaretz reported that in the 6 weeks after those airstrikes began, ISIS had recruited 6,000 jihadis, a huge number, in a group that's supposed to number 20 to 30,000. 1,500 of those were foreign fighters. So I think this central perception from the beginning that the Iraq War was a dumb idea, not simply because it was going to be a lot harder and a lot more complicated than it was advertised as being, but it was a dumb idea because ideologically, it was the stupidest thing that the United States could do. But now we're in the new war, and this is the war that we're going to lose. Indeed, it may be that the United States, with its overwhelming military power, has succeeded only in transforming an eventual and speculative threat into a concrete and immediate one. Now the Bush administration finds itself trying to perform the tightrope walk of building a stable and friendly government beneath the shadow of escalating violence and a growing and inevitable nationalism. The administration began its Iraq venture with an air of absolute determination, taking a kind of grim pride in defying the United Nations and doing what is right. America and Iraq will need a different kind of determination now and a newfound honesty to go with it. Don't start a major policy until you know how you're going to finish it. Because when I look at this war against the Islamic State, I don't think our leaders know how it's going to finish. And it's going to be carried to the next administration, and who knows how far it will go. And at the moment, our actions are helping this group recruit dramatically. If we look at the Islamic State in Iraq, I think there is a fair amount of evidence that it would have collapsed in certain parts of Iraq of its own internal contradictions. I think that the United States, if it has learned anything, it should have learned to stop acting against its own best interests. And I think that the U.S. has not learned that.
The United States has more people in prison than anywhere else in the world. Almost 2.5 million prisoners are currently behind bars, equivalent to jailing the population of Chicago, America's third largest city. Human rights groups report a majority of them are Latinos and African Americans from poor communities. They're locked away for nonviolent crimes, from buying illegal narcotics to illegally crossing into the United States. Because of overcrowding, the federal government and several states are paying huge sums of money to private prison companies or for-profit prisons to house thousands of inmates. Critics say for every new person that gets locked up, private prisons get richer. As correspondent Mike Kirsch reports, it's led to concerns about inmate care.
It was here in Nashville, Tennessee about a decade ago when a particularly brutal murder went down that still has people talking about it to this day. It happened inside this prison. The victim, Estelle Richardson, a mother of two, doing time here after buying pain medication illegally on the streets. The morning she died, she had been found unresponsive in solitary confinement with a fractured skull and several broken ribs. According to the police report, the only people that could have laid a hand on her were the 4 prison guards ultimately charged with killing her: Andre Hendricks, William Wood, Jeremy Neese, and Joshua Shockman. Shockman, when not guarding prisoners, a mixed martial arts fighter, as seen in videos posted on YouTube. His nickname, the Warhammer.
If you don't buy a ticket to come see the Warhammer, you're going to get punished.
Shockman's not responded to several CCTV attempts to reach him. As a prison guard at the time, he was described as being overzealous in his dealings with inmates. But he and his fellow guards denied killing Richardson. Some say what may have helped their defense is that the crime happened at this particular prison, a private prison company contracted by the local county government. And not just any private prison company, but the biggest, richest, most powerful private corrections company in the United States, Corrections Corporation of America, headquartered right here in Nashville, Tennessee. Corrections Corporation of America, or CCA, operates, according to its website, more than 60 other private prisons across the United States. From federal detention centers housing undocumented Latino immigrants to state prisons with American inmates serving time mostly for nonviolent, drug-related crimes. In all, CCA houses 70,000 prison inmates nationwide. When CCA's prisoner in Nashville, Estelle Richardson, was murdered, CCA managed to get the murder charges against its guards dropped. How? Because the surveillance camera over Richardson's prison cell had inexplicably been turned off the day of her murder. Without visual proof of who killed her, CCA's guards walked free. Richardson's family protested, saying that CCA got away with murder, a murder that remains unsolved to this day. The history of American prisons in general is not a pleasant one. The United Nations has referred to U.S. prisons run by federal, state, and local government as some of the most dysfunctional, abusive, and torturous penal institutions known to man. In the early 1980s, private prisons began to emerge across the U.S. landscape, mainly to relieve overcrowded prison populations in traditional government-run facilities. Prison populations that began to explode as a result of America's war on drugs policy that was landing thousands of new drug offenders behind bars every day. For example, overcrowded and overwhelmed government-run prisons like in California have been ordered by courts to alleviate overcrowding by moving inmates to newly available prison space offered by private prison operations. In other words, California pays private for-profit corrections companies to manage some of its prison population. Essentially, private prisons are renting out storage space for prisoners. The more prisoners they take in, the more money or profits they make on their leases. Companies such as Nashville-based CCA have been profiting enormously. CCA's annual revenues today, for example, approach nearly $2 billion. So when CCTV set out to report about private prisons, we naturally felt it only logical to speak to someone here with the private prison industry leader, CCA.
What can I do for you?
Yes, I'm here with CCTV, Chinese Central Television. My name is Mike Kirsch. I'm a journalist.
What can I do for you?
I'd like to speak with the media representative for CCA.
All right, stand by.
Thank you. CCA's corporate media representative is Jonathan Burns, who CCTV emailed ahead of time requesting an interview and a tour of a CCA prison facility.
Okay, I spoke to Jonathan Burns. He said that he had spoke with you.
Yes, we corresponded by email, that's correct, and he told me to email my questions in.
He's not here.
Oh, he's not here?
No.
The press representative's not here?
That's correct.
Is there someone else I can speak with?
No, you need an appointment.
CCA ultimately declined CCTV's request for a prison tour and for an interview.
Jails are terrible because...
So, next, we turn to Alex Friedman, considered one of the nation's foremost experts on private prisons, because he was a prisoner at one for 6 years at a CCA prison here in Tennessee for an armed robbery he committed as a young adult that he says almost got him killed.
When I was robbing the store, the guy did not want to be robbed, and so he pulled out a .38 and shot me, and then I got into a gun battle with him, shot at him. I was incarcerated for committing the crimes of armed robbery, assault with attempt to commit murder, and attempted aggravated robbery.
You don't look like such a person.
People tell me that all the time, and then I have to ask them, well, what does an armed robber look like? I don't offer any excuses for the crimes I committed back in the late 1980s and early 1990s. I basically like to say I was young and stupid and greedy at the time, and now I am older and less stupid and less greedy.
Friedman says his experience as a prisoner is like a PhD in how private prisons operate. Indeed, Friedman's testified on private prison issues before U.S. legislators. Since his release from prison, he's run a nonprofit prisoners' rights watchdog group called Private Corrections Institute.
This is Alex Friedman.
Routinely blowing the whistle against what he claims is rampant corporate greed and corruption inside the private prison industry. Examples of which he says have been widely publicized, starting with what he calls the poster child of private prison greed, America's notorious Kids for Cash private prison scandal in Pennsylvania in 2008, when more than 2,000 school-age children who'd committed minor offenses, if any at all, were locked up in private prisons that had paid 2 local judges $1 million each in bribes to send these kids to jail.
Sending children to jails in return for cash.
2 judges in Pennsylvania pleaded guilty today to taking huge payoffs to send teenagers to privately run detention centers.
Both judges received lengthy prison terms, one of them memorably confronted by an outraged mother whose young son killed himself after his private prison ordeal.
You scumbag! You ruined my f***ing life! You remember my son?
Other examples of greed and corruption, says Friedman, private prisons profiting by overcharging government clients or American taxpayers for prison guards that are underpaid and also dangerously underqualified. That has led to abuse of prisoners. In one case, to the alleged rape of dozens of female inmates at a private prison in Kentucky. To violent prison riots at others. To prison escapes while prison guards were allegedly slacking off and not paying attention. To prison guards like these 3 guys from CCA's Nashville prison caught forcing inmates to make handcrafts that they'd turn around and sell, pocketing the proceeds. Friedman says private prisons are so dysfunctional because as private companies, they are not obligated under law to publicly report much of what goes on inside their prisons, as government-run prisons are required to do. Thus, private prisons are said to be less accountable and less transparent about how they operate. What is clear, he says, is that private prisons are making enormous profits by various means. Achieving these profits, for example, by maintaining lower overhead costs by paying their employees much less than employees working in government-run facilities. In addition, private prisons profiting, of course, from each cell space they lease out. The more cells filled, the bigger the contract and profit. And some private prisons are said to actually have contracts that include what are called lockup quotas, which means that taxpayers ultimately have to pay a penalty tax for any empty cell space in a prison should local authorities not deliver enough prisoners to fill the spaces. A for-profit private prison system that Alex Friedman says seemingly encourages cities and states to arrest as many people as possible in order to fill the cells of private prisons or pay penalties if they don't. In short, profits based on how many people are locked up. Friedman asks, what's next? Privatizing police forces in the U.S.?
And to give an example, if we use the example of a privatized police force, and we told people that our policemen will no longer be public officials, rather they'll be private corporate employees, and the more arrests they make, the more money they'll make. And most people would say, well, I see a problem with that, because they would be incentivized to arrest as many people as possible, because that's how they would make more money. And that's not going to work. But we have the exact same system in our private prisons, where private prison companies make more money if they incarcerate more people for longer periods of time. So this is the inherent problem with for-profit prisons, is that they are for-profit.
Friedman says private prison executives like some in charge at CCA in Nashville are living large in million-dollar country club estates outside of town, raking in multi-million-dollar salaries after generating multi-billion-dollar profits each year for shareholders and investors that, among them, include several large American banks and U.S. corporations. In addition to private prisons becoming more and more wealthy, there are other prison industry service-related companies making huge profits. From prisoner transportation companies that move prisoners from court to prison and back, to firms providing medical services to prisoners. Or phone communications for inmates and their families. And there are large food companies that must feed private prison inmates. All these companies earning huge profits, says Friedman, on the backs of inmates in private prisons across the United States.
We are opposed to private prisons. We seek the abolition of the private prison industry. We believe that for-profit corrections has no place in a civilized and democratic society.
What's particularly aggravating to CCA is that Alex Friedman has bought stock in the company, which allows him to show up at CCA's annual shareholder meetings. You might call Friedman the ultimate party crasher. How would you be received at cocktail hour?
Not very well, I'm sure. I do attend their annual shareholder meetings. As an activist shareholder, I own stock for the purpose of attending their shareholder meetings, questioning their board members, and filing shareholder resolutions. They can't keep me out. So even as a former prisoner at a CCA prison, CCA still has to welcome me to their annual shareholder meeting just like any other shareholder. And they have to respond to my resolutions just like any other shareholder. I mean, I'll go in, I'll shake hands with the corporate executives, I'll ask my embarrassing questions that they don't want to answer.
Such as?
Why are you incarcerating women and children as young as 5 years old in prison-like conditions in immigration detention facilities?
How do they respond?
Well, of course, there's corporate responses, corporate speak. Sometimes it's, well, we can't respond because of pending litigation. Or, no problem, we've already looked into that and investigated ourselves, and there's nothing to see here. There's no problem at all.
When CCTV attempted to raise these criticisms with CCA, CCA declined comment and instead sent us a public relations video.
Every day we serve our communities. From small towns to large cities at more than 60 locations across our country. We play an important role in public safety.
CCA also lauding its employment of many U.S. military veterans, all while generating 5 to 15% in savings to American taxpayers, helping 30,000 inmates each day learn job skills, giving each student, inmate, person a chance to return home, to get a good job, build a better life. The private prison industry has strong support from a respected nonprofit think tank in America known as the Reason Foundation that advocates less government and more privatization in society. The Reason Foundation's Leonard Gilroy tells CCTV that private prisons are just part of the American way of doing business.
Number one, we live in a capitalist society. Governments contract out literally, almost everything you can think of. Quick examples might be building and operating highways, trimming trees in city parks, operating hospitals, paving streets, collecting trash, providing water and wastewater, all kinds of things. And so in that context, operating a prison is not something that is necessarily inherently governmental. And so to that point, I think there really isn't any inherent problem with a company making a profit if they're providing a good service, just like you would find in the private sector. If Apple makes a good phone or Samsung makes a good phone, we reward that company with profits. That's a signal in the marketplace. Prisons are certainly not utopias, and you're going to have bad incidents that happen in well-run public prisons, and you're going to have bad incidents that happen in well-run private facilities. That is part of the system.
No, it's very common. These companies want as little transparency as possible. They are private companies. That means that in general, what they do is in the private sector. They are not transparent. They're not accountable to the public like our public institutions.
And what happens to inmates once they leave private prisons? We asked CCA if it could introduce us to, for example, a prison inmate it had recently helped find a good job and better life outside this prison. CCA declined to show us one.
This gonna be a real.
Though some local nonprofit human rights workers in Nashville introduced CCTV to one recently released CCA inmate now living in a wooded area just a few miles from CCA headquarters. His name is Jesse James Upchurch.
I'm homeless, man. I'm walking out here in the cold. I ain't got no place to go, man.
CCA confirmed Upchurch's long criminal history, which spans 30 years. In and out of prison for crimes ranging from selling illegal narcotics, burglary, to most recently, aggravated assault. What about people who see this and they say, well, Jesse, you put yourself in this position. You shouldn't.
I've done my time, but you put me out here and you expect me to do right, tell me to do right, you educate me to do right, but if I ain't got no help, what am I supposed to do?
You got anywhere?
Man.
You got anywhere to live?
I ain't got no place to live, I ain't got no place to go.
Upchurch says he can't find a job because of his criminal history. And he says when he's sent back to CCA for minor crimes like drinking in public, he says it's almost as if CCA is happy to see him come walking back through the door, because it means more profit.
Follow the money. So if you want to know why we have private prisons, despite all the documented abuses that have occurred over decades, follow the money. See where it leads. So you have these companies being paid hundreds of millions of dollars from government contracts. And then they take a portion of that money, millions of dollars, and they give it back to politicians in the form of campaign contributions, donations, and lobbying expenses. And as a result, they get more contracts. So it's a recurring cycle, and people are making money.
The higher number of people arrested and sent to these prisons, says Friedman, the bigger the profits for companies like CCA.
There are losers and there are winners. The winners are the ones making money. The losers are everybody else.
The losers, Friedman says, private prison inmates like Jesse James Upchurch.
Because I'm sick of being here. I'm ready to lay down and die.
While private prison companies like CCA claim many prisoners have access to programs to educate themselves and to prepare themselves for a new life after serving their time, the fact is more than 60% of prisoners released from private prisons return after committing another crime. That spells more profits for private prisons, at the expense of many prisoners in America hoping for a second chance and staying out of prison for good.
My dream is to just get into a place that's warm, where I can eat, where somebody says I love you every day. Thank you for being alive.
Upchurch says he believes his well-being as a prison inmate inside a CCA prison is the last thing on CCA's mind.
All they're doing is trying to make money.
A week later, after drinking, Jesse was arrested and booked back into the local CCA prison. After the murder of Estelle Richardson here at its Nashville facility, CCA paid her family $2 million to settle a wrongful death lawsuit. Still, Friedman hopes someone will come forward with information about the crime. He's raised a $35,000 reward for that information. Little has been heard from the 4 guards accused in her murder since charges were dropped against them. Josh Shockman, the Warhammer, survived to fight another day, and today is said to be a fighting instructor. To date, CCA refuses to answer CCTV's questions about Estelle Richardson's murder. Though through its public relations videos, CCA assures the public it hires only the best employees at its facilities, who get the best parking spots right up front, from Employee of the Month to those working in quality assurance. Quality assurance?
Yes, quality assurance is basically covering things up.
What goes on inside private prisons, says Friedman, unfortunately, often stays inside private prisons.